Hello and welcome. My name is Bijay Acharya and we are going to talk today about the consumer surplus and producer surplus. My student number is 1481737 and my friend Satsan will also join us in the video presentation today. So let's get started. We have got some of the outlines below. We'll be talking about the consumer surplus, some of the examples, some of the changes in the market, shift in supply curve, demand curve, and everything. So let's talk about the consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is basically the difference between what you want to pay and what you have actually paid for it. So if you go onto the market and then you thought that the price for any product would be around $10, and when you found out that the price for that product was only $8, so the difference between what you wanted to pay and what you actually paid for it was $2. That is consumer surplus. So on a supply and demand curve, consumer surplus is the area between the equilibrium price and the demand curve. So in the demand and supply curve, there will be a demand curve and a supply curve, and there is an intersection between demand and supply, which is known as the equilibrium point, which will determine the price and quantity into the market. So in a competitive market, firms have to keep prices relatively low, enabling consumers to gain more consumer surplus, because if the price will increase, then the customer will not be able to buy the product. So if the customer doesn't buy the product, then it will be a loss for the producers. So they basically have to keep the prices relatively low so that the consumers can have some consumer surplus. And if the markets were not competitive, then the consumer surplus would be less and there would be there will be greater inequality. So in case of monopoly, if the producers can fix the amount whatever they want, then the consumer surplus will be low and then there will be a greater inequality into the market. And the lower consumer surplus leads to higher producer surplus and greater inequality. So if the consumer surplus is low, then the producer surplus would be high, and vice versa. And also, consumer surplus enables consumers to purchase a wider choice of goods if they can buy the product in a lower price. So if you think that the product the price of the product was $10, but you bought it for $8, that basically means you saved $2. So you can buy another product from that $2. So there will be a wider choice if you go onto the market, and then if you find the item in a lower price and you have a consumer surplus. So in this chart we can see that the consumer surplus is at point A, which is in a blue shaded point, and it is below the demand curve and above the equilibrium point. So the amount which is there will be a price fixed and quantity. So when there is a equilibrium point, the amount of the part which is above the equilibrium point and below the demand curve is known as the consumer surplus in this chart and in all of the charts. So deadweight loss, we have got a deadweight loss over here. So deadweight loss is also known as the excess burden, and it is a measure of lost economic efficiency when the socially optimal quantity of a good or a service is not produced. It basically means also that the allocation of resources has not been fully utilized. So if the resources is fully utilized, then there is a optimal utilization of resources. But if there is no resources, some of the resources that has not been utilized, then it creates a deadweight loss, in which part neither the consumer nor the producer will benefit from selling a product. And deadweight loss can also be applied to any deficiency caused by an inefficient allocation of resources. So deadweight loss can be ignored, and if there is a optimal utilization, then the deadweight loss will be cancelled out, and the producer surplus and consumer surplus will increase. We have got an example down here, and the example is pretty much clear. It says if a person goes in to buy a new car and he was thinking to buy it for $20,000 and bought it for $18,000, then there is a surplus, consumer surplus of $2,000, and he can invest that money or buy another product from that amount. And consumer surplus is very essential for the market as well, for all the consumers. So consumer surplus and changes in market. In this section, we'll be talking about the price, and the price changes can come from different sources. So price changes can come from quantity of the product being supplied, or from the government intervention. So price changes can come about because of changes in the condition of demand and supply, and also they can arise from government intervention in markets and changes in price brought about by adjustment in the business objectives. Some factors increase consumer surplus, whereas other factors may cause consumer surplus to fall, and we will be looking that into the next slide to make it more clear, with the changes in the market of demand and the change in the market of supply. So this chart is for the shift in demand curve, and a shift in demand curve is basically when a demand will change other than the price changes. So the price will remain same, but the quantity of any product will change. So it occurs when demand for goods and services changes even though the price doesn't change. In a graph, we can see that the consumer surplus can be shown as the triangle to the left of the demand curve and above the market price, which is in the yellow and red graph. This is because the consumer would have been willing to spend about above this price for the good, and yet they can actually buy it in a cheaper price. So if the demand curve is perfectly elastic, then consumer surplus will equal to 0, because there is elasticity of demand, and this is because they would only be willing to buy the product at a certain price, and wouldn't pay for that product for more or less. So there will be no consumer surplus. So if there's a perfectly competition market, the prices will be equal to the willingness of any consumer. So there will be no demand, there will be no consumer surplus, and there will be no shift in demand curve. So we can see on the chart down here as well, when there is a shift in demand curve from D1 to D2, then the equilibrium point has gone from B to H, and when the demand has increased, then the consumer surplus has increased. So when there is a shift in demand curve from D1 to D2, the consumer surplus has increased from A, B, C point to G, H, and I point. So what we can say from this is, if there is a rightward shift in the demand curve, other things remaining the same, the consumer surplus will increase, and if there is a leftward shift in the demand curve, then the consumer surplus will decrease, because the price of the product will go high when the demand will shift from left side to right side. Okay, so the change in change in supply curve leads to a change in supply curve as well, which causes an imbalance in the market that is basically corrected by changing prices and demand. And an increase in the change in supply shifts the supply curve to the right, while a decrease in the change in supply shifts the supply curve to left. So in this case, we can see that it has been shifted to the left. So so we can say that the supply has been decreased. So when the supply decreases, then there's a shift in demand curve, shift in supply curve, and the quantity and price will also change. And when so before the um, supply is the consumer surplus was at point B, A, and C, and now it has gone down to B, D, and E. So the consumer surplus has been decreased. So all the producers and consumers have to think about this, and it is very essential to look up to the consumer surplus and producer surplus to make the market efficient. That's all from my side. Satsan will take over now, and then he will explain about the producer surplus. Thank you so much. If there's any question, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you, BJ. Now we are moving forward to producer surplus. So, what exactly is producer surplus? Producer surplus is the surplus of the producer as the difference between the amount which the producer is prepared to supply the products with the exchange of the actual amount that he receives. As shown in the figure, producer surplus shown by the area above the supply curve and below the market price. Higher prices provide an incentive to supply more to the market, which is the profit motive. As shown in the figure, the triangle ABC is the producer surplus. So the next slide is about producer surplus example. So in the example, we can see that if the producer is willing to sell any goods or product for $4, but he can sell it for actually $10, he gets a surplus or a profit of $6. So the amount $6 is actually the producer surplus. So the $6 is the producer surplus. Moving on to our next slide is about the producer surplus and the changes in market. So the changes in the equilibrium price are directly linked to the surplus of the producer. The producer surplus increases as the price increases, and obviously as the equilibrium price decreases, the surplus of the producer also decreases. As shown in the figure, I'll just give a short explanation of the figure shown in the slide. As shown in the figure 1, as the market price for goods or services changes, so will the producer surplus. So in our first example, we can see the shift of the supply curve. For example, it is caused by a fall in price of a component or any sort of wages. So lower supply cost cause the market price to fall and the equilibrium quantity to be expanded from Q1 to Q2. So the original price was A, and the producer surplus after Q1 for the increase in the supply or the fall in supply caused price F, and the producer is selling Q2. So what happens to the B into producer surplus? It increases from area ADB to a bigger area FEC. So lower supply curve increases the producer surplus. For the figure 2, so what happens to the producer if demand increases? Our example shows that the effect of the outward shift of the demand curve, the equilibrium point changes from B to E. So the producer, having originally sold the quantity at Q1 at price A, can now still be the output Q2 at price D. So what happens to producer surplus? That it is increased from area ABC to a bigger area DEC. Producer earn in terms of higher production surplus, and the supply cost falls on the left hand side. moving on to our next slide is the shift in supply curve. The shift in supply curve are directly related to the surplus of the manufacturer. If the production rises, the surplus of production also increases. I mean the surplus of producer increases. Sorry. When the supply curve falls down, the surplus of producer also decreases. Hence, the price elasticity of supply is inversely connected to the surplus of producers. So next slide is about the shift in demand curve. The changes of the demand curve are directly related to the sum of the surplus of the producer. So if the production rises and the curve moves from the right to the surplus to the left, as shown in the figure, the triangle P1BA, which is blue in color. So the producer surplus at the price P1 is actually P1BA, and when the price increases from P1 to P2, you can see there is a slight uh, surplus of the producer, which is increased from the area from the price P1 to P2, resulting the area of P2CA. So the more the changes in the demand curve is directly related to the surplus of the producer. Thank you.